In London, the march has just begun, taking our way through the streets from Parliament Square. You saw just now in my latest broadcast that huge gathering of people there.
Great work, mate.
Thank you very much, appreciate it. We saw such a huge gathering of people just at Parliament Square, and this, I mean, we've only just left, so you can't really get the extent, the scale of the people that are here, but I'll try and, I'm right at the back of the march, so I'm going to try and well, there's people still joining back there. There's still people in the park. You know, there's people it's frantic about that. People couldn't find each other. So there's a whole load of people back there still. So I'm right at the back though. So I'm going to try and get through the march just so you can get the scale of this, because I'm going to try and commentate on some of the things that have been going on that. To try and spread awareness to those people at home who perhaps might be watching this thinking what's really going, you know, there's lots of people right now that we're kind of in the 40% who are kind of not sure what's happening. They're a bit concerned about what they're seeing in terms of the government's response now, and people are starting to turn. So it's my hope today to share some insights that will inform and educate those people who are kind of starting to evaluate the situation, thinking none of this seems to make sense anymore. So I'm going to try. So I'm going to try and give you an indication of the scale of the people that are here today, because you know, I've been to almost every London march over the last 2 years, and we've had some huge marches through the city, which you don't see in the mainstream media, of course. You don't see the images. But this, I'm pleased to say, is one of the largest yet, maybe the largest. It's hard to tell standing at the back, so I'm going to try and make my way through the crowd to try and give you a sense of just how broad this march is. And as always, you can sense the vibe here, and I have to say, it's so distinct from the vibe in the rest of London. I don't know if you've observed this in your own communities, if you're watching this from further afield. As I came into London, I came in on the train. You know, I sat on the train without a mask, and you know, 99% of the carriage was wearing a mask, and it just felt like this sea of sadness, this sea of sameness, but the sea of sadness. And you know, I stood out like a sore thumb. People looking at me like, why is he not wearing a mask? But this is what people have been conditioned to do. Which is crazy. But we have this concept of the illusion of consent, the illusion of consensus rather, not the illusion of consent. It's a different concept. I'll talk about that in a minute. The illusion of consensus, which is what I'll be talking about in my podcast interview with Professor Matthias Desmet on Monday. So if you, I'll explain more about the concept in a moment, but I won't go into too much depth because we're going to talk about it on Monday. But Professor Matthias Desmet has been one of the iconic guests that I've had on the podcast. His episode has had well in excess of 1 million views in its own right, where we talked about the rise of authoritarianism and the 4 steps that lead up to authoritarianism, and explored the psychological principles about why people comply under these conditions, and how the bystander effect works, and how, you know, even though people can see something is not right, they will stand and witness it but not act. So on that point, the distinction is the people here today have made the informed decision to come here and stand up for their rights, their freedoms, and everyone is here for different reasons. Some people are here to stand up for stand against pending lockdowns. Some people are here to stand up for medical freedom. Some people are here to stand up just against the way in which this is operating. Some people are standing up for the children. There's a whole manner of issues that people are standing up for. But there's a distinction between being a passive observer of the situation and an active participant. Now, to be an active participant, you don't have to come to a protest. You know, it's a form of action. There's campaigns, there's petitions, open letters, connecting your MPs, you know, forming local communities. There's an abundance of ways that you can become active in a movement like this. But it's the ones that are passive, they're just silently observing, that we need to go from passive to active, to become engaged. Because with this illusion of consensus, people start to think that all the data and all the science and all the people think the same thing. Well, I can tell you, all the people here do not have the same consensus as the government. I can tell you that for certain. But if we were to sit in a room, and I've done this with large parts of the movement, and discuss the issues, we still wouldn't have consensus. We'll have commonalities, of course, but we live life with our own experiences, our own paradigms, we've got our own values and beliefs. But in terms of the way that the mainstream media and the government have portrayed the situation, remember our perception is our reality, the sources of information that we consume largely inform our perspectives. But when you live in a situation like this where we've got non-stop 24/7 digital media and the mainstream media basically seemingly towing the same line, then it creates that illusion of consensus. So on Monday we're going to talk about that we don't have consensus. And in the scientific community, there is not consensus. In the medical community, there is not consensus. In the education industry community, there's not consensus. In the business community, there is not consensus. And so on. So the illusion of consensus leads people to feel that what they see on the television must be right. Because everyone thinks and feels the same. And it's interesting because you start to see these quiet whispers becoming louder. And by that I mean people are starting to, in their own private quarters, with their friends and family, say, you know what, I don't think this is right. Something's not right. And they're slowly having the courage to ask questions. There's almost, there's someone asked me about my vaccination status the other day. I said, firstly, that's a private matter, but you can probably guess by my content what my decision has been. And he said, oh, thank goodness, I'm not alone. It's like, you're not alone, but people are afraid to have that conversation because they've been conditioned to believe they have to have this this procedure, this intervention in order to participate in civic life. It's just immoral, it's unethical. So this illusion of consensus is something we need to burst, and it's a very thin veil. The consensus has a very thin veil. And events like this, where there are thousands of people quite literally, and I'm going to again try and give you some perspective. I'm walking my way at speed now, well, not at speed, I can't walk at speed with this many people in. But I'm making my way through the crowd so you can get a sense of the volume of people that are here. So I'm going to try and give you some insight. So, there's a large crowd, let's put it that way.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, particularly your videos when you've spoken spiritually and positively, and I've sent that to friends and family who have been struggling and consumed with the fear. And when you're a young man and a child and embraced in all this stuff, the positivity has been wonderful. And yeah.
Lots more of that to come.
You're my good to see
Good,
you.
yeah.
I know you.
Would you do a quick comment to the camera on update of our...
Can do.
Yeah, so I'm with Lilith here. Lilith was on the podcast this week. We were talking about the NHS mandates. Now, obviously, when we did our interview, the mandate hadn't passed.
Yes.
So what's happening now? What's the latest for your campaign?
So we're just trying to reorganise and trying to keep our roles all safe and do things legally, so that we have a better chance to go through employment tribunal.
Yes.
So what we need is our members to really stick to their guns and make a decision. You have every right to choose. What we need is we need to play a short game or a long game, and I really encourage a long game at the moment. So we're still if this goes through the NHS staff, because it will come across to teachers, to police officers, to everyone who's what medicines we should be taking.
Indeed. And now, so where can people go to find out about the campaign and to support?
So we are on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, NHS100k.com. That's the starting point. We have some action plans which we will be updating in the next week or so. But definitely anyone who is vaccinated needs to withdraw consent for their health records, because at the moment what they're doing is they're sharing your records across every every business out there.
Yes,
And when your health becomes an object of discrimination, it needs to stop.
So how do people do that?
So on nhs100k.com, we have an action page where we have a list to links on how to withdraw how to limit your access to health records.
Yes, fantastic. Well, excellent work we do. I've already met several nurses and doctors here today.
Yeah, we're quite littered around, so we are around.
You're here, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for what you're doing. So
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So this is that was Lilith from the NHS 100 campaign. She was on the podcast this week. We actually recorded her interview prior to the vote on Tuesday, so we only broadcast it 2 days after the actual vote, and at which time, you know, there was a lot of hope that the MPs would do the right thing and stand up against this bill. But as we saw this week on Tuesday, now following the care homes, the NHS are now subject to the same mandates, which affects hundreds, as it stands, over 100,000 NHS workers. And I say as it stands because that's predicated on 2 vaccines. Whereas, as we know, the booster campaign is driving forward, and they're pushing to 100% for that. So, you know, if the condition changes to 100% triple jab for the NHS workers, and all of a sudden that number, you know, rapidly exceeds 100,000, because there's lots of people now in the NHS who are single jab, double jabbed, and they don't want to progress because of the things they've seen and the things they've learned. So the vote obviously went ahead on Tuesday, and the hypocrisy of all of this is, of course, we're in winter season now, and you know, we're led to believe that COVID puts undue pressures on the NHS over winter. If you actually look at the capacity data in the last year, it is true that the ICUs have been under pressure. The hospitals in general have been below capacity. In fact, during the first wave, capacity was 40 to 60% because the government's just cleared out the hospitals, which has already had an enormous effect on public health, as we know. But you imagine taking over 100,000 healthcare workers out of the system. Imagine doing that now at winter. Because if you look back, I mean, The Guardian, it's hilarious. You can go back in The Guardian headlines in the last 10 years. And bizarrely, The Guardian are always talking about how the NHS is understaffed in winter. But then they don't really challenge these mandates, which would put even more pressure on the NHS. But you imagine the existing winter pressures, magnified now by these huge waiting lists, magnified by the COVID protocols that are being subjected to in hospitals, magnified by staff who are having their livelihoods threatened. Quite clearly, this is going to put an enormous amount of pressure on the NHS, but imagine taking those staff out now at winter. It would crush healthcare. But of course, they're waiting until spring. You know, we need you in the winter to deal with these pressures, and then what we'll do, to thank you for your hard work, on when it comes to spring and winter is over, we'll give you the boot. We'll give you the boot for not complying. Now, let's just look at that from Common Sense Corner real quick. If the NHS workers who are either not jabbed, single jabbed or double jabbed were a risk to others in the hospitals, then surely there'd be a risk now. Particularly with all the hysteria about Omicron, and that's a whole different story, but surely there'd be a risk now. And the idea would be, actually, if you want to minimise the risk, the highest risk time of the year for illness amongst the vulnerable, the elderly and those other categories is winter. We get less vitamin D, we move less, we circulate, there's more pressures on our immune system this time of year. So surely, logic would say, now would be the time you would want to stop people, if their logic held up, by the way, only if their logic held up, which it doesn't, then surely now would be the highest risk time for the NH staff to be in if they're not fully jabbed. Well, of course, we know it's not a risk. We know that the vaccines don't reduce transmission. The whole thing has no scientific basis. The House of Lords put together a report which was written in the British Medical Journal this week that said there's no scientific evidence for NHS vaccine mandates. Yet there they are, they're passed. You know, they're passed. Again, it goes back to my comment in my previous video about the difference between ideology and objectivity. The new paradigm of science, what I would call anti-science, but what's called the science now, is based upon an ideological moral argument. The moralization of policy. It's a moral argument that it's in the public interest for every single living soul to be vaccinated. There is no risk assessment. There is no analysis of the cost-benefit analysis. There's no underlying recognition of the risk profile, the varying risk profile of the virus. It takes the assumption that we're all equal at risk, and it's a moralized decision. But the moral authority has been assumed by the state, whereas historically the moral authority would be a family decision or a community decision, or in elder times in places of worship, the religious institutions would inform some of the morals of society. But now the moral judgment is assumed by the state and their public-private partnership. The big the pharmaceutical industrial complex, the big corporations and the state determining what is moralistic, and then very quickly transforming people's belief systems through their propaganda to moralize this policy at scale. So we're following a moral judgment rather than a scientific one. So we have the new science of ideology and moralization, and we have the old science of objectivity based upon rationality and evidence. But we're seeing this growing void between the kind of rational world of science and this new emotionalized, moralized version of science. So as I was saying, if the NHS workers were truly a risk, well, there'd be a risk now at the peak of winter. But we know that's not true. So these NHS workers are going to bust their gut through the winter, which they will, because it's always going to be hard in winter. It's always hard work for the NHS staff in winter. I've got friends that work in the NHS who've done so more than a decade. It's always hard work. It's even more hard work when the government put protocols in place that make it harder to do your job, and it's even harder when you start to threaten employees and make them fear their livelihoods and therefore resign ahead of time. So there's a whole bunch of hypocrisy here. So that was, if you're just tuning in, I just had Lilith on the show from the NHS 100K campaign, which is standing up for the NHS workers' rights to choice. This is about choice. The media will position it all as anti-vax nonsense. It's choice. It's bodily autonomy. It's an individual right to choose. So if you didn't see my interview with Lilith, anyway, that was Lilith. If you didn't see my interview with Lilith, I spent an hour with Lilith on Thursday night. You can watch that broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Odyssey. But I was before all this happened, I was beginning to tell you a story about the difference between the vibe here at the protest, which is always exceptionally high vibe, despite what you see in the newspapers about violence and antagonism. Tell me now, watching this live, what do you see? Happy, smiley faces. Wonderful people having wonderful times, standing up for human rights, body autonomy, civil liberties, standing up for the merits of science, standing up for humanity, standing up for compassion, standing up for love, standing up for unity. You don't see an angry mob. You see a high vibe crowd here to do the right thing for humanity, at least what they believe is the right thing, which I believe is the right thing. But coming here on the train today, unbelievable. I mean, it's just the suppression of people's emotion. It's just a sad, sad, silent world. Now singing. So, there's something about what's going on right now which has just led people to have their heads down. There's this bleak, tired, sad energy about the world. And that really is it's one of the things that we need to take stock of, because how do we... when we place a value, when we place value on our lives, in the form that we've seen most recently, with it's just about COVID cases, we... Pleasure. The value that we place on life has to include everything that makes us human. You know, we can merely exist or we can live. And the joy de vivre, the things, the family, the right to family life, our human connection, soul to soul, entertainment, It's been sacrificed. Now the difficult thing is here, many... no vaccine passports. But for a lot of people, they see, so we're talking about the science, and they think, again, the science, we have this belief that we're all sick until proven otherwise. We have this belief that everyone is at equal risk from COVID-19, that everyone ends up in hospital. And there are, of course, sad cases where that does happen. But we can't reduce all illness to one illness. You know, people are asking me, where are all the other illnesses gone down? It's like, well, you don't hear about them because this little C has become the big C, and there's no more conversation about any other health outcome other than COVID. So you can understand with the constant bombardment that people feel a certain way. But
Katie, you're one of us.
It's Katie Hopkins. Katie Hopkins getting bombarded. Hello.
Get a picture of you.
Sorry.
So, yeah. I forgot what I was saying. I first thought that was Dr. Zoe Harcum as Katie Hopkins, slightly different character. What was I saying? You can understand how people have been watching the TV, kind of just bombarded with this fear and belief that they're at equal risk as everyone else. I mean, just today I was talking to some of my friends who I met earlier at the Park Square here, Parliament Square, and some of their friends didn't make it here today because they were worried about the Omicron variant, even though they stand for the cause. And that's an important conversation because we can still be wary of the virus while still standing up against tyrannical authoritarian mandates. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. But I know a lot of people who watch my channel who are clinically vulnerable, and they are worried about the virus themselves. Absolutely, and right, you know, that's absolutely reasonable. But they also do not want to see the world evolving as it is evolving, unfolding in this way, with this fear-based, draconian, authoritarian, you know, suppression of human rights and individual rights and liberties, and the suppression and the erosion of democracy. So you could be completely in fear of the virus, but you are still absolutely against what is happening here. They aren't mutually exclusive, which is it's an important thing to recognise. But there are people that said they weren't coming here today because they're fear of Omicron, because Christmas is coming up, and they don't want to take it back to their families. Now, some people watching this who have no idea what's going on here may think, well, that's a reasonable intent. Well, it is a reasonable intent. But the intent and the means are separate things. The intent to want to avoid harm is one thing, but then we have to apply the means and logic to that sentiment. So, for example, it's been very well documented and known since March last year that the transmission of COVID-19 in an outdoor environment is exceptionally unlikely. It's incredibly close to zero. Professor Woodhouse, who's part of the SAGE group, you know, this is documented in March and April 2020, coming up to 2 years ago, that transmission in this outdoor type of environment is exceptionally unlikely, to close to zero. So you can have the intent to, or the concern of infecting someone else. You can still have that concern, but we have to go back to rational science. So I'm not saying it's impossible, by the way, before the fact checkers dump in and said, he said this. I didn't. I didn't say that. I said it is possible, but negligible to close to zero. And, you know, look at the SAGE documents on it. It's documented. So we have to be applying common sense to the situation. Now, of course, what we're witnessing, really, amongst, particularly with the mandates we just heard about the NHS and the vaccine passports, COVID certification, is a war on individual rights. But we've got this false notion under this new the science ideology that individual rights are a threat to collective interest, to public interest. Well, what is the public interest? Again, I spoke about this on the podcast last night. The public interest, firstly, if you actually break it down, is the collective interest of all of the members of society, individuals, all the individuals put together in the form of a society. Because when we talk about society, we talk about it like this abstract concept. Well, society is just a collection of individual human beings. So you can't have society without the individual. Society is a collection of individuals, and in order to determine the public interest, we have to take the amalgamation of the individual interests and rights of those individuals as a collective piece. But if we do that based upon ideology rather than facts and an assessment of the broader needs of individuals and society, which includes healthcare, education, economy, mental health, well-being, etc., education, well then how can we say something's in the public interest when so much harm is being caused? So individual rights are being threatened here. The right to choose what you put in your body. This has been a long, hard-fought right, the right to bodily autonomy, and they all use these strange descriptions, these kind of get-outs, which tried to say that they aren't infringing on that right, in the sense that you do have a choice. For instance, in the NHS or the care homes, you can leave your job. Well, that's not really a choice. That's coercion. You could argue, by strict definition, it is a form of choice, but you're forced to choose between your job and a jab, and that's coercion in most people's minds. But it comes back to this idea of the public interest, and there's this idea that we do all these things to protect one another.
Defy! Do not comply! Resist! Defy! Do not comply! Defy! Do not comply! Resist! Defy! Do not comply! Thanks for everything you're doing,
So this is talk about protecting others, protecting the public interest, which is a very good marketing technique, because there's lots of bystanders now actually cheering us on, which is fantastic. People coming outside of the security guard of the building there is waving. It comes back to what we've been talking about so far, which is the idea of this podcast. We may even run an event on this subject. If you remember last year, we had the Question Everything Lockdown Summit, where we got lots of scientific experts from across the world to join us in London for one day, where we recorded this one-day seminar. We're thinking of doing the same, just to answer that question: why is this happening? So that we can start to make sense of. It sounds like the music's coming from their helmets. You can see the police here beside me. So we're thinking about doing a whole session on why and how is this happening, which is breaking down those political, social, cultural, economic devices on my own. I wouldn't know where I am. So here we are. We're walking through the streets of London. It looks like that could be Hyde Park to the side of us here. Do you know where we are? Where is this? Grosvenor Place. If that means anything to you at home, that's where we are. But you can see there's the Freedom Rally here walking through London. I'm going to take a bit of time now just to showcase the rally. I'm going to take a break from commentating. Thank you for tuning in so far. Please do share this broadcast. We're broadcasting live. This is multi-streamed on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Dan. Hello, mate. How you doing, man? Good to see you, bro. That's all good. I'm following you.
Stand up, take your freedom back. We are the people, we are the power, we are the 99%. It's over when we stand together. We're there to stand for our future, stand for our liberty, stand up for our rights. Our future will be protected. We will be coerced, pressured, an experimental injection. still on the clinical trials until 2023.
Say no! Say no! Say no!
Hey.
You're right. Wow.
So you're going to see your smiling face.
Where they fear human interaction, where they fear the
How's
air.
it going?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So if you got anything else lined
That's
up?
my fifth appearing in the picture was Fee here from Stand in the...
Yeah.
Right.
It's a good way to start your morning.
Absolutely.
On a Sunday, it's yeah, it sets you up, and it's like a focal point for the week for
Yes.
so many people, including myself.
Yes.
Yeah, get down to work.
Well, yes, an incredible initiative. I mean, 700 parks, you know,